In the end, the ballad knows that the last resting place of the sovereign will is the oral text, as the last resting place of the nobles is the sea. But the civilization in which we live and are now studying this poem is irreversibly committed to the sovereignty of the written text and the braid letter of the king sent to Sir Patrick Spens, or, for that matter, the presidential directive. It is the function of poetry to enact the state of affairs of the reader, which it is empowered to do because the culture conserves the poem and comes from outside every historical present, bearing the knowledge that is its peculiar generosity, poetic knowledge. What is that knowledge? In stanza 3 of the poem before us, now we must look back at the poem so that we are actually reading stanza to which I refer. In stanza 3 of the poem, Sir Patrick, who bears the name of a singular person and not the index of a category like the king, is found walking on the sand in the space between sea and land, the marginal or liminal space between two elements. Stanza 3. The king has written a braid letter and signed it with his hand and sent it to Sir Patrick Spens, was walking on the sand. Sir Patrick Spens is a master of the threshold, a negotiator of elements, for example, sea and land, wind and water, as the sailor is. Sir Patrick Spens, thematic temporality, the kind of time associated with Sir Patrick Spens, the state of the verb which characterizes Sir Patrick Spens, by contrast, is the past progressive, was walking, right? By contrast to the sovereign present tense, of which the king is captive, and which also contributes his power. Sir Patrick reads the braid letter of the king very slowly, as we see in stanza 4 of the poem. The first line that Sir Patrick read, a loud laugh, laughed he. The next line that Sir Patrick read, the tear blinded his eye. Now what is this moment? This is the moment which Aristotle called in his analysis of tragedy the moment of recognition, or anagnorisis, the moment when the general structure of reality is recognized by the hero as the structure of his own life. It's the moment of recognition which in, for example, the archetypal tragedy, the story about Oedipus, Oedipus says all the prophecies are true. The story that is told about the generality of persons, namely they're disposed to kill their father and marry the mother, is true about me. Now it's this moment of recognition which we must unfold in order to discover why Sir Patrick Spens' act is important at all, and what the contours of choice that inform the will that acts as Sir Patrick Spens does are. It is this moment that the poem before us is constructed to conserve. The tear blinded his eye. Whether Sir Patrick Spens' laughter registers the honorability of a communication from the king, or the absurdity of the task to which that same letter obligates him, it is followed by the tear which unmistakably indicates knowledge of two kinds. The first is the knowledge that the continuity of the social order requires obedience to the king as the principle of order, and the second is knowledge that obedience to the king, refusal of which would subvert the human world, will entail Sir Patrick's death and the death of many others. I want to put this again, for example, in the characteristic form of a double bind. The king wills his own contingency. He wants to take on relationship, send a ship for the daughter or for the bride. The king, the second factor, cannot by his nature, which is the same as the social order, take on any relationship. The third factor is that there must be a king. That Sir Patrick Spens is honored epidactically by representation across time, in the voice of the folk, must be understood in view of the fact that Sir Patrick Spens wills in full knowledge obedience to the social order and its commands, represented by the braid letter of the king that sends him to his death. Thematic in all my findings with respect to the analysis of poetry is the encoding in the poem of the will to structure, no matter what. And that recurrently encoded, thematized, or stated will to structure constitutes a limit to the power of the kind of representation which we are studying. The double bind which I'm speaking of, or contradictory state of affairs from which there is no exit, is the crisis of communicative systems which the poem addresses, and is essentially like the motive to poetic writing in general as I understand it. Poetic knowledge is knowledge of states of affairs like this, and the will to bring them to mind. What does Sir Patrick Spens know and take into account which the king either does not know or does not take into account, and what is his action? In tragedy, for example, the story about Oedipus, the hero learns the conditions of action, generally his genealogy, after making an irreversible choice. In comedy, the hero learns before irrevocable choice such truth about the world as makes it possible for him to avoid tragic suffering. Knowledge comes too late in tragedy. It comes just in time in comedy, making it possible for the world to sort itself out toward a marriage and an happy outcome. Sir Patrick Spens does not suffer tragedy. Sir Patrick Spens chooses tragedy. He is a comic hero, a man who knows ahead of time that you shouldn't go out on the ocean at the time of year at which he has been commanded to do so. Sir Patrick Spens is a comic hero who chooses a tragic outcome as an act of judgment which the poetic voice of the poem offers as paradigmatic. At the arithmetic center of the poem, we're talking about the sixth stanza now. Remember that the arithmetic center is always of semantic significance in poetic systems. There is a stanza divided between two voices, between two kinds of knowledge. Note it. Make haste, my merry men all. That's Sir Patrick Spens' voice of obedience to the king. Our good ship sails the morn. Now we hear the counter voice, the voice of the wisdom of the folk. Oh, say not so, my master dear, for I fear a dreadful storm. Two kinds of knowledge meet in that central stanza. One is the knowledge of the necessity of obedience to the principle of social order. The second is the knowledge derived not from the reading of the written letter, but from the reading of the signs of nature. That obedience to the king's command will lead to the death of the sailor. In the conjunction of these voices, which is bonded by the only imperfect rhyme in the poem, morn, storm, is stated the two kinds of knowledge between which Sir Patrick Spens chooses, and by choosing establishes an hierarchy. In effect, reestablishes the hierarchy of his social order as it is given. The king's command is obeyed, and the king's sovereignty affirmed. Make haste, our good ship sails the morn. That second kind of knowledge which this poem brings to mind and repudiates is expressed in the thick, timeless language of lamentation, which is the generative tone, deep, characterizing counter-knowledge of the collective voice of the ballad text. Stanza 7, so precious, so astonishing, so without fellow. Late yestreen, I saw the new moon with the old moon in her arms, and I fear, my dear master, that we will come to harm. Unlike the elder knight who advises the king and who is inside and compliant to the king's will, the sailor who symmetrically advises Sir Patrick contradicts his will. He is the reader of the signs of the natural world. His language is cognate to and of the same kind as the truth language of the children, the language of wearing and rusting and washing away. You can hear the kindred language of the sailor who speaks late, late, late stream to the children's language when they speak of the wearing away of structures in nature. The children's game exhausts the sovereign will to build, and by putting that will in the service of difference produces ordered social experience. The capacity to read the signs of heaven is the counter-literacy to the literacy which reads the letter, the literacy cognate with the sovereign will to meaning which writes it. Sir Patrick Spens possesses both kinds of literacy and both kinds of knowledge, and so also may the king. If the king knows what Sir Patrick knows, then he uses that knowledge to destroy Sir Patrick Spens, the master of the threshold and the potential hero of a comic story of growth and new states of affairs. Patrick Spens clearly possesses knowledge of both kinds and acts to suppress the knowledge most expressed by his nature. This action constitutes the privilege which makes him the subject of story. Who, as fair lady, does the singer in Sir Patrick Spens' poem address? Since the singer in the ballad is always in the situation of addressing the folk gathered round him, it is the principle of collective life, immanent to history, that constitutes the muse of the ballad. This principle of collective life is informed by a knowledge which is counter to the knowledge of individual life. And the difference between muse and history is repeated in the ballad as the difference between the collectivity and the individual. The difference between muse and history in the high cultural poem is repeated in the ballad as the difference between the collectivity and the history and the individual. The question that I put before you as a question about representation in general is the question which arises when we observe that the collectivity chooses the continuity of the social structure which also oppresses them. The desire for social order is greater than the desire for life. In this ballad, as often in others, and we have to look hard at that, as we find it repeated as a thematic even in our most wildly transgressive poems. The new moon is the dark of the moon, or the bright sliver of its first reappearance, right? The slight delineation of the world to come. In the revolution of the relationship of the sun and the moon, the old moon is the world which can never come again. But the letter of the sovereign cannot be contradicted and means death. The skill of the best sailor cannot be denied and is powerless to effect its will. The ballad is the trace of consciousness without hope, except the continuity of consciousness itself, which the ballad maintains and circulates. The limits of the power of the king who sits in the limitless estate of the present tense of generic establishment are the sea and the weather, the cycles of history, and the proper name Sir Patrick Spens, which specifies the individual who weeps, the ephemeron, the human fact that is realized by particularity and dies of particularity, unlike the generic king who never dies and cannot weep. The alliance between the anonymous singer of the ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, the voice that says the poem, and Sir Patrick himself is inscribed in the poem by their common use of the plural possessive pronoun our. And that's a very important finding. And also by the praise word good. The ship which the king calls this ship of mine in line 4, Sir Patrick Spens calls, note it, our good ship in line 22, 6th stanza. In line 29, 8th stanza, the speaker of the poem refers to our Scots nobles, and in the last line but one of the poem, to good Sir Patrick Spens. But the praise word good was first heard in the speech of the king in line 3. Oh, where will I get a good sailor to sail the ship of mine? In the end, The language of value of the hero and the language of value of the narrator coincide, as does, on the crisis of the central word importing value in the poem, good, the language of both with the language of the king. The authority of the ballad singer is, like that of Sir Patrick, the authority of the collectivity, signified by the pronoun our, which possesses on behalf of more than one possessor. And the ballad, as do all poems, indeed all representations whatsoever, brings to light and offers to consciousness the mind of its maker, which is always in some sense, but emphatically, in the case of the ballad, the community. The significant action of this hero, Sir Patrick, articulates the social paradox of one, the principle both of social order and the self, and many, the principle of relationship and therefore life. What the king wants when Sir Patrick Spens is summoned is a good sailor to sail the ship as it were of state or mind, a technician who possesses the technique of negotiating the contradictory terms of this paradox, the imperative to be one and the imperative to be many. In the next poem which I will study, the imperative to be one is the myth of the phoenix, and the imperative to be many is the myth of the turtle dove. As I observed with respect to this children's game in the last lecture, the poem does not solve the paradoxes of social experience, but models a negotiation of them. What then shall we say about the ballad singer who produces an image of himself as the social poet, Sir Patrick Spens, an heroic actor who chooses the continuity of an oppressive social order? That is his honor, a choice which requires the willed death of the individual. Now notice, because I think it a weighty observation, it's one that I actually think is of the utmost importance, and that is that the maintenance of all discourse depends upon structure. Poetry as a social art and an art of language repeats the structure and calls it good. Thus a limit of the expressivity of an art characterized for its freedom, its radical character, its capacity or promise to contradict a state of affairs, is driven by an inner necessity to affirm the incontrovertibility of the imperative to structure. Perhaps there is only one poem in the whole world which the collective mind dreams night after night in many different forms, and our business as readers is to recover the one urgent dream thought of the universe, which is a nightmare because it is structured like the social paradox at the point of the conflict between the impulse to be one, that is the impulse to structure, and the impulse to be many, to reflect contingency, to be hospitable, to desire. It is, at any rate, this social paradox in terms of which Sir Patrick Spens acts and is memorialized. But the heroism of the ballad poet and the ballad hero, who, as we see, are one will engaged in a single memorable action, is called good because it produces the language of persons unmistakably and paradigmatically human, the language of persons that we hear in the voice that sings, "The king sits in Dunfermline tomb, drinking the blood-red wine." That voice which the ballad brings to light, which is the voice that makes persons present, the voice which the act of representation the ballad constitutes, calls honorable. I return, however, to my concern with respect to the inevitability of the will to structure. The constraint, however, that the analysis that I'm making requires us as students to consider is the limit these considerations predict for the representation of possibility. Do you understand the point? If the will to structure is what is praised, and indeed the will to structure is praised as contradicting or a value higher than the will to life, and if that will to structure is the poem's will to its own representability, to its own capacity to do its work of transmitting across time the images of what otherwise would be lost, then we've got as students to consider the limit of this consideration that this consideration predicts for the representation of possibility. The sign is that the new moon takes the old moon in its arms. Any act of representation, any new making, any new moon, any new making toward the visibility of the world, comforts and repeats the old, and the old requires the choice of order over the choice of life, and that most surely signifies a storm. The spectacular poem which we will study in the next lecture, Shakespeare's Phoenix and the Turtle, is an inquiry, as I have said, upon the question of the problematic of new states of affairs altogether, and constitutes an analysis of the constraints upon representation, which are also the limits of possibility which the imperative to representation places upon the relation of desire and actuality as the poet understands the matter. Such is, in any case, the crisis of mind intent upon the question of human hope, which derives the speaker of the Phoenix and the Turtle, the stipulated greatest poet of the civilization, to difficult utterance, the poem which we shall study next, as we shall see.